The cold wind howled through the narrow streets as Margaret clutched her thin coat tighter around her frail body. The once busy sidewalks were now nearly empty, with only a few people rushing past, too lost in their own worlds to notice her. She wasn't asking for much, just a little kindness, a little warmth. But in this city, kindness was a rare currency, especially from people like Richard Holloway. Richard, a man of immense wealth and even greater arrogance, sat comfortably in his luxury car, watching Margaret from behind tinted windows. A smirk played on his lips as he whispered to his driver, "Look at her, begging like that. Pathetic. Some people just don't know how to work for what they want." He let out a cold chuckle, shaking his head. To him, people like Margaret were nothing more than a reminder of what he never wanted to become. Weak, desperate, invisible. Margaret had heard the laughter. She didn't need to turn around to know it was directed at her. She had seen Richard before. His name appeared in newspapers. His face flashed on television screens. A businessman with power and influence. A man who dined in the finest restaurants, while she counted pennies for a single meal. But Margaret wasn't just any poor widow. She had a son. A boy who carried a name that held weight. Barron. Barron Trump wasn't like other kids. He had seen the world from both sides, the glitz and glamour, but also the harsh reality many ignored. And when he found out what had happened to his mother that night, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just going to let it go. No. This was personal. The next morning, Richard Holloway received an invitation, one he could never refuse. But he had no idea that this time, the game was about to change. Richard Holloway barely glanced at the elegant envelope as his assistant placed it on his desk. His morning routine was the same: black coffee, stock reports, and a quick review of the market. But something about this invitation caught his eye. The paper was thick, expensive, embossed with gold lettering. A high-profile event, no doubt. He smirked, assuming it was just another gala or fundraiser where he could flash his wealth and shake hands with people who pretended to admire him. He tore open the envelope and scanned the words. It was an exclusive business gathering at one of the city's most prestigious venues. The host? Barron Trump. Richard's smirk faded for a moment. That name carried weight. It wasn't one he could ignore. Interesting, he muttered under his breath, tossing the invitation onto his desk. He had met many powerful people, but he had never dealt with Barron directly. He knew the young man had intelligence, influence, and a quiet but commanding presence. But what could he possibly want with him? Later that evening, Richard arrived at the event, dressed in his finest tailored suit. The venue sparkled with opulence. Crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed decor, a sea of well-dressed elites engaged in hushed conversations. Waiters glided through the room carrying trays of expensive champagne. It was his kind of place. But as he stepped inside, something felt different. Eyes lingered on him longer than usual. There was an air of anticipation, as if something was about to happen. And then he saw him, Barron Trump. Standing at the far end of the hall, Barron was composed, his expression unreadable. He exuded quiet confidence, effortlessly commanding the room without even trying. As Richard approached, Barron met his gaze with calm intensity. "Mr. Holloway," Barron said, his voice smooth but firm. "I appreciate you accepting my invitation." Richard extended his hand, but Barron didn't move to shake it. Instead, he gestured toward a private lounge at the back of the venue. "Let's talk," Barron said simply. Richard felt a flicker of unease, but masked it with his usual arrogance. "I'm always open to business discussions," he said smoothly. But as soon as they stepped inside the lounge and the doors shut behind them, Richard realized this wasn't just a business discussion. Barron sat across from him, his expression unreadable. There was no small talk, No pleasantries. Just a long, heavy silence before Barron finally spoke. "You laughed at my mother," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Cold, sharp, controlled. Richard stiffened. His mind raced. Mother? And then it hit him like a punch to the gut. The woman in the cold, the one he had mocked just days ago. He had barely spared her a thought. But now, sitting across from her son. A son with power, intelligence, and resources. The weight of his actions settled on him. Richard started, but Barron cut him off. "You think wealth makes you untouchable," Barron said. "That people like my mother don't matter. But let me show you something." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Richard hesitated before opening it, but when he did, his stomach dropped. Inside were documents, reports, evidence, things Richard thought no one could ever uncover. Shady business dealings, questionable investments, backdoor deals that could ruin him if exposed. How? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm. "Power isn't about money, Mr. Holloway. It's about influence. And the way you treat people when you think no one is watching, that matters more than you realize." Richard swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Barron tapped the folder lightly. "This could destroy you, publicly, legally, or..." He paused, letting the tension stretch. "You could make things right." Richard's mind spun. He had always been in control, always dictated the terms. But now, sitting across from this young man with the upper hand, he realized he had underestimated the wrong person. "Tell me," Barron said, his voice dangerously quiet. "How will you choose to fix this?" The air in the room was suffocating. Richard knew this was the moment that would decide everything. But what would he do? Richard's fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents. Every page was a revelation of his own misdeeds, proof of the corners he had cut, the people he had stepped on, and the rules he had ignored to build his empire. He had always believed that power meant never having to answer to anyone. But now, sitting across from Barron Trump, he realized just how wrong he had been. His throat felt dry. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Barron studied him for a moment before leaning back. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Holloway. Wealth isn't an excuse to treat people as if they don't matter. My mother may not have millions in her bank account, but she has dignity. And no one has the right to take that from her." Richard swallowed hard. He had been in difficult situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a business rival trying to outmaneuver him. This wasn't about money. It was about something deeper, something he had never truly considered before. Barron tapped a single page in the folder. "This right here, if this information gets out, you lose everything. Your business, your reputation, your influence." He let the words sink in before continuing. "But I'm not here to ruin you, Mr. Holloway. I'm giving you a choice." Richard's jaw clenched. "What kind of choice?" Barron folded his hands together. "Fix what you've broken. Not just for my mother, but for every person you've stepped on to get ahead. Give back. Make things right." He tilted his head slightly. "Or we can let the world decide what to do with you." The weight of the moment pressed down on Richard like a stone. He had spent years believing that money made him untouchable. But tonight, a young man, one he had underestimated, was showing him the truth. He exhaled shakily. "If I agree, how do I know you won't still release?" "This?" Barron's expression remained unreadable. "You don't." He let the words linger. "But real change doesn't come from fear. It comes from choice." Silence filled the room. Richard looked down at the papers again, then back at Barron. In that moment, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not just power, but conviction. A kind of strength he himself had never possessed. Slowly, Richard reached for a pen. "Tell me what I need to do." Barron gave a small nod. "Start with an apology, a real one." The next morning, Margaret stood outside the small cafe she often visited when she could afford a warm cup of tea. She wasn't expecting much from the day. But then, a black car pulled up beside her. The door opened, and to her shock, Richard Holloway stepped out. For the first time in his life, he looked unsure, human. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, addressing her by name, something he hadn't even bothered to know before. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. A real one." Margaret blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. But there he was, standing before her, looking at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. "I was wrong," Richard continued, "and I want to make things right." From that day forward, Richard Holloway's name began appearing in headlines again, not for scandals, not for business takeovers, but for something else entirely. Acts of charity, community programs, financial aid for struggling families. Many speculated why the sudden change. Few knew the real reason. But Margaret did, and so did Barron. Because sometimes, the greatest power isn't in wealth or status. It's in knowing when to use what you have to lift others up, instead of pushing them down. And for the first time in his life, Richard Holloway finally understood that.